Oakville as we know it today is rich in the history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the lands of the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. We stand in solidarity with Indigenous brothers and sisters and honor the four directions: the land, the waters, the animals, the plants, and the ancestors that came before us. Oakville stands on land that's covered by Treaties 14 and 22. I'm standing on Treaty 22 land right now. And we should remember that we're all treaty people. We acknowledge that these are the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and we'd like to thank them for their stewardship.
Hello, my name is Sherry Saevil. I'm an Indigenous woman from Treaty 6 territory. I'm Cree. My mother came from Mistawassus First Nation in Saskatchewan, and she's a residential school survivor. I'm honored here to talk to you today about the Orange Crosswalk, as well as the importance of National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. My mom has been in a residential school for almost 9 years of her life, so I know very well the effects of residential school had on her. I also know the historical traumas that were placed on her and her family, as well as Indigenous people in Canada. Most of us don't know very much about Indigenous people here. We weren't taught that in school. You know, here today I'm proudly wearing my ribbon skirt. It represents missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It represents the care of the water, that we all have a responsibility to look after the water. But most importantly, it also represents the children that never made home. And had I wore this skirt when I was a young kid going to school, I would have been chastised and I would have been sent home because I'm not allowed to wear skirts like this. I'm also a 60 scoop kid, so I too was also kidnapped from my mom in school. Funny that is, you know, when school is supposed to be a safe place for kids. I never got to say goodbye to my mother, and I never saw her for probably 8 years of my life until I went home when I was in grade 3. So there's that very important stage in life where you learn an awful lot when you're a young child and you take it to your adulthood. This was a genocide that was committed in Canada, and we must understand that, and we must rally together as Canadians to see what we can do to make Canada a more understanding country when it comes to Indigenous people. But please remember that this history was also kept from you. We know as Canadians that if we knew that young kids were being kidnapped from their home, taken to residential school and not being returned, I truly believe that Canadians would have rallied up and said, enough, these are children that are being taken away. You know, the Orange Crosswalk that we have here in Oakville was done through community, asking the town and the councillors to make that commemorative space for the Orange Crosswalk. We know that that crosswalk represents all the children that went to residential school right across the country. It is not a territory and it's not a land acknowledgement. It is to honor the children that went to school, those children that never came home, and the children that are still finding their way to their families. We stand here very humble. I stand here always trying to spread the message of hope, of peace, of understanding, because we all have a role in the truth and reconciliation. We all have a role in understanding what those orange crosswalks mean. We all have a role when it comes to September 30th, but it has to go beyond September 30th. There's so many things that we can do as Canadians to learn a little bit more about the truth and reconciliation. One of the things is to read the calls for action. Another thing that I think that people should read is 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act, so that you get a better idea of the oppressive laws that Indigenous people faced on a regular basis. But we also have fantastic resources here in Oakville, fantastic resources that we've worked collaboratively at the library. We continue to have awareness days or even showing films where it features Indigenous people. All we're asking you to do is come along, come for the journey, come for the learning. Miigwech.
My name is Darin Wybenga. I'm from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the treaty partners for much of the Greater Golden Horseshoe and Oakville, seeing that we're here today. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I just want to give a brief overview of our role on the land and the treaties that we hold in the area. Our ancestors came here on the north shore of Lake Ontario about 1700, give or take a few years. And we came to occupy, control, and exercise stewardship over about 4 million acres of land. We are a very seasonally migrant people. We moved with the passing seasons. So in the spring and in the fall, you would find us on our salmon fisheries at places like this, 16 Mile Creek, or at Bronte, or at the River Credit, or at Etobicoke Creek. And we lived quite happily on the land. And first, we had trade relationships with the French, and later on, we traded with the British. Now, the great thing about the French is they never had a desire for our lands. But that all changed when the British took over from the French about officially 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. If you remember right, the British had 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of the United States. They had a tremendous hunger for land that was only increased with the advent of the American Revolution. And so the rebellion starts, but there are many people in those 13 colonies that want to remain loyal to the Crown. We call them loyalists, but all kinds of nasty things could happen to you if you were a loyalist in those days. But if you could make your way north into the maritime region of Canada, or north of Lake Erie, north of Lake Ontario, you could be rewarded for your loyalty. The Crown would give you a grant of land for starting your lives anew. And so that starts off treaty making in what becomes Southern Ontario, because the people that had land were the First Nations. So the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation had its first treaty with the British Crown in Niagara, right in the midst of the Revolution, 1781, for a strip of land along the Niagara River. And the next treaty we had was in 1784, negotiated in 1784. Those were early treaties, and when we went into the treaty-making process with the Crown, initially we didn't understand what we were getting into. We expect to share, the British expect to own it. We find the forests chopped down. We find fences on our pathways. So we could no longer carry out our traditional lifestyle. The hunting, the fishing, the gathering is all seriously diminished. Our traditional economy collapses. We went from 4 million acres of land in 1781 to just 200 acres of land at the Credit River in 1820. So with the remainder of our land gone, taken by the British Crown, we were in essence landless except for 200 acres at the Credit River. It's now the site of the Mississauga Golf and Country Club. We move into that mission village and transform our lives completely. So I'm very thankful to say we've prospered, and as a people, we're always realizing and recognizing that we have to transform ourselves even today to keep pace with a modern society. We're very much a resilient people, and we realize that's part of our history. We're proud of who we are, and we know we'll keep changing to benefit our people.
Ani, bonjour. Stephen John Paquette Gijnikaj. My spirit name is Bamanse Bamat Windinase Gijnikaj, which translates into He Walks a Good Life. I am Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, from Wikwemikong unceded territory, Mukwudodem of the Bear Clan. I'm very pleased and honored to be here today. I want to start off by acknowledging that we are on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. but also at the same time acknowledging that many different First Nations have walked on this land and called it home. I am a survivor of the 60s scoop. I have had multiple generations of my family attend residential school. So the work that they do is so very, very important. I love the setting that we're at right now. You know, when I look behind me, we're looking at history right here, right? We're close to the water, we're close to the creek, we're close to the lake. And that's important to Indigenous peoples. One of the things that people often forget about is that as Indigenous people, we always had a connection to the land. We had a treaty with the land. We have a relationship with the original stewards of the land, which are the flyers, are the swimmers, are the four-legged, and even the crawlers. We have an acknowledgement with Nabish, or water. Water is life, water is sacred. One of the other things that I would like to take an opportunity to remind people is that you are on treaty land here in the town of Oakville. You're on the traditional treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And that we have to understand that in terms of treaties, as Indigenous people, we had treaties long before Europeans came here. Because why? Because we had our own form of governance. We understood politics. We understood diplomacy. And you know, we're told by our elders that relationships, which is what a treaty is, that it's not just important, it's not just very important, it's above all others, and that they are sacred, right? So it's not just looking as a treaty as just a written formal document, but understanding that Indigenous perspective to it. So when we are also speaking about treaties, we also have to acknowledge that when those treaties were exchanged, that they were done through ceremony. That all Indigenous people here on Turtle Island had ceremonies that were essential to their cultural identity. Ceremonies are important and essential to all Indigenous peoples. And you might not be aware, but throughout the history of Canada, that many of our ceremonies were actually outlawed, that we were not allowed to practice them, and that there would be consequences for you practicing your ceremonies. So it's great now that, especially in my work here in Oakville, that I feel comfortable in any buildings, that if I feel that need to conduct ceremony, that I am free to do it. And it's not that it's tolerated, but the fact that it's actually embraced as part of my cultural identity. And that's something that I think that people need to also understand and have an appreciation for. I'm very proud to be one of many partners in the Halton area, and specifically in Oakville, in their journey through truth and reconciliation. I'm very proud of the work that the town of Oakville and the museum and the public library have all put forth towards truth and reconciliation. It's interesting work doing this, because oftentimes people just like to talk the talk. Whereas what I'm proud of is Oakville is that they walk the walk as well. And I find that they are leaders here in the Halton area of the work that they're doing towards truth and reconciliation.